A little bit about me before we get going. I'm a legal director at Ashford's, specialising in food law, advertising, and kind of general commercial law. I spent a lot of my time in-house working at Harrods, won't be going into that today, and also at a large advertising agency, and so being both in private practice and in-house, which has given me quite a unique insight into the challenges that businesses face. And I love talking about greenwashing because it's not a new concept, but it's something that's getting the attention of the regulators increasingly, with more and more powers to fine people. It's a great place to pick up conversation now as we're going into October and the laws are starting to change. And we're seeing what's going to happen in the next couple of years, just to give you a bit more information about what's going on and hopefully have a nice discussion about what's to come.
Thank you, Kristy. My name's Paul Collins. Good afternoon, everybody. I'm environmental lawyer at Ashford's. I joined in April. Before that, I was at the Environment Agency for several years. And before that, I worked in various government positions, advise on all aspects of environmental law, and that expands each year. And delighted to be talking today on greenwashing. And in terms of some relevant experience, I've had a number of secondments in-house where I've reviewed environmental policies, compliance procedures, and trying to keep myself up to date on this very exciting area of law. So in terms of what we're covering this afternoon, what is greenwashing? That will be the question which we'll start with. Then we give some examples of Advertising Standards Authority and Competition and Markets Authority cases which have appeared over the last couple of years or so. Then I'll just run through some of the regulatory requirements, and I hope that doesn't become too much of a list, but it's quite a few legislative and kind of voluntary codes we just need to run through on that. Then in terms of discussion in terms of what organisations can do to flag up greenwashing risks and how we can manage that. Then a little bit of horizon scanning on as to what's coming up and how we can prepare for that, and wrapping up there with a Q&A session which will not be recorded. Kristy.
Thank you, Paul. So before we kick off, I just want to know from you, what do you understand greenwashing to mean? And it's a bit of a trick question because there's no legal definition, but I'd love to know from the audience what you understand it to mean. So just pop it in the chat or feel free to speak up. Got farm washing creeping in now slowly as well. It's gaining more and more traction, but maybe that's for another time. No takers? Okay. Paul, if someone asked you what greenwashing is, how would you describe it?
Oh, it's a good question. I think it'd be the use of statements or imagery or actions, I think, where you're claiming a product or a service, an activity is more environmentally friendly than it ought to be, or that actually is. And yeah, often where you're making comparisons with competitors as well. So it's an approach which is clouded in mystery a little bit, and tries to diminish the potentially more environmentally damaging aspects of an organisation or business's activities, I think.
I can see we've just got some in the chat as well. So claiming more environmental than it is, yes. Yeah. Making out to be greener than you are. And yeah, I mean, green in both sense. Green as in greener and more environmentally friendly, and use of the colour can also be included too. Making unsubstantiated claims to deceive consumers, yep. Claiming to do something that is for the good of the environment but is not that environmentally friendly. So all of those things are true. And because there is no legal definition, that's sometimes a good and a bad thing. And most of the time when people are making untrue or misleading statements about the environment or the impact a product or service has, it's not done, in most cases that I see, intentionally, but it is being done a lot at the moment. And mostly comes down to, I think, a genuine misunderstanding about how best to promote a product or service in line with the consumer protection rules that we have, which is to prevent untrue and misleading statements about products and services. So it might be how the product looks. So on the packaging, that even the name of the product could be alluding to a green claim, and fall into that greenwashing category. It could be reports a company puts out about what they do. And environmental practices and sustainability and ethics do mean slightly different things. They're all a little bit more nuanced. Public statements, it might be an unintentional public statement about what a company is doing for good, and that links into environments. Could be even like down to symbols and logos. So it doesn't have to be express. It doesn't have to necessarily be you're saying your product is environmentally friendly. It can be very subtle. And we'll go through some of the cases that have come about recently that aren't so subtle. But it's quite interesting, the interpretation that's been taken on them. And, use of the colour green is also another thing that can, combined with maybe a logo or the name of a product, can imply greenwashing is at play. So kind of making that impression to the consumer that a product has more environmentally friendly credentials than another. Comparative advertising is rife with this. Again, not intentional. And I think that's really important to remember, is a lot of the time this is not intentional. People fall foul of the law without meaning to. They want to talk about the benefits of a product, and maybe you are doing amazing, ESG, social governance, and a lot of B Corps are doing fantastic things too. But in doing so and talking about it in a certain way, you can fall foul of the law. And that's what we kind of want to highlight at the moment. And I think a really good example to kick off with is looking at Innocent. So obviously Innocent, owned by Coca-Cola. They had this, I don't know if you remember seeing it, it's a beautiful ad with a child looking up and everything had turned green with fruits and things like that. And the strapline was little drinks, big dreams. Now, they didn't expressly say we are more sustainable, our products are environmentally friendly, we are a green company, but they implied that by choosing an innocent drink, you are saving the environment in some way, shape or form. And the ASA, the Advertising Standards Authority, found that this particular ad, the one you can see on the right-hand side with the lion covered in green, implied that by buying an innocent drink, you were making a positive environmental impact. And the ASA found that's not to be true because it's single-use plastic. And it was really interesting to see Innocent's reply. And in their reply, they talked about how actually plastic bottles are better than glass bottles because they have 3 times lower carbon, and glass alternatives have a higher carbon emissions because of the transport and the weight, and they're recyclable. But the ASA didn't hold that. So they said, no, this ad shouldn't appear in its form again. Essentially, you're greenwashing. So we haven't seen anything pushing boundaries to that extent in the food and drink sector. There's been a lot on fashion, which Paul will take you through. So that was one example. I thought it was quite interesting because it wasn't that expressed, but it was quite subtle, but it did receive quite a lot of complaints, quite a few from competitors, and that's kind of what you'll come up against. Now, airlines have gained a lot of traction, especially from the ASA, and I think there's going to be more with the CMA looking at airfares and taxes and how companies are presenting themselves as healthier or more environmentally sustainable options. So Ryanair, I mean, I think you can kind of see here, so their kind of advert was lowest emissions, lowest fares. Now, this was another ASA complaint and a ruling that was upheld that said, no, this ad should not be seen in this form again. It's misleading. And why was it misleading? And they found that it's because air travel by its very nature emits high levels of CO2 gases and just the sheer kind of impact on the environment air travel has. They couldn't say to consumers, we're environmentally friendly, which is what this ad was implying. Ryanair, interestingly, came back and said, well, the low emissions statement is true because we use a young and efficient fleet of aircraft and we're almost always full. So they're not flying a plane that's half full because the fares are too high. But because these claims weren't substantiated and there was this implied kind of undercurrent of we're an environmentally friendly airline, it was not upheld. And we're seeing this more and more. But it is true, using a younger aircraft, having fuller flights has less impact on the environment, still has a huge impact on the environment. But yeah, this was basically misleading the consumer into thinking that air travel was environmentally friendly. And there's a lot around hybrid cars or fully electric cars and how they're presented in marketing materials. So recent one was Mazda, and so their strapline was Mazda hybrid combines the power of a petrol engine and the efficiency of a battery-powered electric motor, exciting, efficient, and sustainable. Now, again, this ad was banned because it wasn't looking at the full life cycle of the car itself, and it also wasn't talking about what happens when the car's in petrol mode. And a lot of these car adverts have been pulled up on this because they're not supported by a high level of substantiation. And that's the problem. They're trying to say this car as a whole is more environmentally friendly. But under the rules at the moment, you can't say that. You need to look at when it's in electric mode, this car is X, Y, and Z. And that's where brands are falling foul of what they should be saying. So, yes, when it's in electric mode, it doesn't emit emissions, but the brakes still do. And it gets into a very granular detail, this decision in particular, and it's quite useful for those in kind of either aviation or car industries to look at when you're looking at that full life cycle and how to substantiate your products. But we're seeing more and more of these coming about. And I think what's a really interesting area that Paul's going to talk us through is the recent examples that the CMA is looking at. And obviously they have much greater power to fine and to take, action against these companies that are falling foul. As the ASA will work in a more collaborative approach. And there's a surprising amount of rulings that are dealt with informally. And that's because the meaning is never intentional. Well, a lot of the time it's not intentional. So just this week, I was looking at, people who'd fall foul of Rule 11, which is the environmental claims on the CAP code. And there are about 8 that were resolved informally. So you won't know what those were about, but it would have been a nice discussion between the company and the ASA about why this wasn't correct and why it may have been greenwashing. And that is kind of increasing in trend. But anyway, I'll hand over to Paul. He can talk you through the recent examples with the CMA.
Thanks, Kristy. So Competition and Markets Authority have been very active in terms of seeking to address greenwashing, in particular with regards to climate change. But I've got 3 examples to briefly run through to give a span of their scope of investigations. First one is the food and drink and household products sector. And in January last year, the CMA investigated or announced that they'll be investigating the accuracy of green claims about household products such as food and drink, cleaning products and home care products. Their main concerns were in relation to vague and broad claims about certain ingredients, which may have been exaggerated in how natural product is, and claims about single product aspects that may misleadingly suggest that the whole product is environmentally friendly, and also the use by Unilever of green colours and imagery. So quite a scope of investigation there, and we're expecting that outcome, checked yesterday, later this year. Another sector where CMA are looking into is very topical, green heating and insulation. And there's an investigation into Worcester Bosch. CMA was concerned that Bosch claims could give a false impression that consumers would reduce their carbon footprint and future-proof their heating system by buying a Bosch boiler system because of its special hydrogen blend functionality, despite most boilers already having that functionality. And in this case, Bosch agreed to a statutory undertaking, and I'll refer to this a bit later, not to make certain claims. And the CMA has also now written to 12 other businesses that sell hydrogen blend boilers to warn them that their marketing could be breaching consumer law, and notice they've issued guidance on that now. So a big topic for them they're looking into. Finally, one Kristy mentioned in terms of fashion retail, CMA investigation into a number of environmental marketing claims earlier this year. CMA announced that it secured statutory undertakings from 3 retailers I've listed there. In turn, undertakings to deal with how these fashion brands will promote their own credentials in the future. It's quite interesting to look through the undertakings themselves, which are online, quite a hefty document. And I think some of the interesting aspects of that statutory undertaking are in how these fashion retailers are to make their green claims, and the use of imagery as well, which is quite an area which could easily be breached, if you like. And interestingly, there's provisions there in terms of record keeping and sign off by senior management and directors in terms of training given by employees of organisations. So quite a useful document to look through in terms of managing internally environmental compliance in this area. So there are 3 sector investigations. So I thought we thought it'd be useful to just run through some of the regulations and codes that govern this area, greenwashing. And advertising and marketing in the UK are governed, greenwashing, mainly by a combination of legislation and self-regulation. The self-regulatory codes reflect and supplement legislation, and it's a self-regulatory regime that deals with most complaints by consumers and competitors. Advertisers that fail to respond to self-regulatory sanctions may be prosecuted under legislation, which I'll turn to now. Okay, so although there's no specific law against greenwashing in the UK, consumer and business protection laws prevent organisations from falsely marketing themselves as green. Principal laws are the Consumer Protection from Unfair Trading Regulations, and these cover claims made in and information omitted from advertising and marketing material for products that are available for consumers, and claims made on the products themselves or their packaging, which is often where these claims are made. So trading standards or the CMA can enforce these regulations using criminal law ultimately to prosecute offences, and by seeking enforcement orders from the court requiring organisations to compensate those harmed by any breach. The business protection from misleading marketing regulations. And again, this deals with misleading claims between business and business. And again, trading standards and CMA can enforce this. If we could just flip one slide, please, Kristy, to the CMA's Green Claims Code. This was published in 2021. Although it's not legally binding, organisations that follow the code should be better placed and to defend themselves if challenged by the CMA. And the code basically sets out the principles which the CMA sees as being, in effect, what the law is asking for, and they're listed there. So that's a very quick skip through the legislation. If we could go back one slide, please.
Yeah, Paul, just on that, on the Green Claims Code, I think it's worth making the point that this is just general advertising principles, advertising law. Like, these are things that you should be doing across all aspects of advertising and marketing of a product or a service, being truthful and accurate, clean and unambiguous, don't hide important information, being able to substantiate. I think that goes across everything, any kind of marketing plan that you have. These are the principles that should be in mind anyway. So hopefully it's something that everyone's doing, but it's just useful to have this in this Green Claims Code, just kind of freshen in people's minds. But yeah, it's nothing new, but we just need to make sure we're doing it all the time and kind of checking whatever we're doing against this to making sure you're not falling foul of the law.
Yes, that's right. And there's some good examples in there as well, which is quite useful in terms of best practice, possibly. Then we can turn now to, in terms of what could refer as self-regulation. codes have been developed, which the advertising industry kind of oversees, if you like. Two principal self-regulatory codes, depending on the media type, obviously, as you probably know. We've got the CAP code, Code of Non-Broadcast Advertising, Sales, Promotion, Direct Marketing. This deals with online marketing, including a company's own website. A lot of organizations trip up. Social media in print, in the cinema, and on posters. And it's section 11 of that code, which deals specifically with environmental claims. Then we've got the UK Code of Broadcast Advertising, the BCAP code. And as you can imagine, this deals with broadcast marketing material on television, radio services licensed by Ofcom. And it's section 9 of that code, which deals with environmental claims. The CAP and BCAP, there's a joint advertising guidance document as well, and it's called Advertising Guidance, Misleading Environmental Claims and Social Responsibility. And that's quite a useful document because it illustrates how each rule of the CAP and BCAP governing green claims may be applied. Also various specific guidance on different sectors as well. So it's always useful looking at the ASA site in particular, which is really useful. Brief mention here of the Financial Conduct Authority, especially financial services, marketing and greenwashing. So we know some financial products are marketed for their green credentials, and UK and EU regulators are targeting the financial services sector as a major source of greenwashing. And financial services rules may apply in addition to the regulations I referred to earlier. Greenwashing is closely linked to the overarching requirement for financial communications to be fair, clear, and not misleading. And that's the fair, clear, and not misleading rule. And the existing rules are supplemented by a new anti-greenwashing rule, which is included in the ESG section of the Financial Handbook. This rule came into effect end of May this year and requires all regulated firms to ensure that the naming and marketing of financial products and services are clear, fair, and not misleading. And it's important in terms of horizon scanning that this new rule is part of the FCA's proposed new sustainability disclosure requirements and sustainability labelling regime. Quickly move on to ISO 14021. This really, ISO has developed an international standard for self-declared environmental claims, and this gives standardization or guidance on the terminology used in making claims, symbols used, advice on how to ensure the detail of any environmental claims is accurate, and detailed definition for several widely used environmental claims. It's quite a hefty document and of some use. And then finally, we have the proposed Green Claims Directive. And this directive is aimed to regulate the way in which green claims are substantiated and communicated to customers. And latest developments on this. So this was proposed in 2023. Negotiations are ongoing with the European Parliament, so we may see something next year with a good wind. And so main thing which I was going to pick up on there in terms of labelling, which lots of discussion as to labelling and to introduce a simplified verification system and processes for that at an EU level. So briefly moving on to risks and challenges. So we've talked about the ASA being primarily responsible for enforcing the advertising codes. Important to know that in terms of managing reputation, this is a big issue in terms of greenwashing, as we know. And substantiation, we know that absolute claims, like other areas of advertising, such claims must be supported by a high level of substantiation. And comparative claims, this is where a lot of organisations are tripping up, if you like, such as greener or friendlier, they must be justified. And then companies must also address the total environmental benefit over products and not just particular aspects of a product. So flipping back very quickly to the advertising guidance I mentioned earlier, this quite an important point, which any enforcement action would pick up on. So that marketers must hold robust documentary evidence to prove all claims, whether direct or implied, that are capable of objective substantiation. Absolute claims such as green or eco-friendly need to be supported by robust evidence about the product's total life cycle. If an advert makes a comparative claim such as greener, must be clear what the product or an aspect of the product is being compared against. There's quite a lot of detail there, I realise, but that seems to be, in terms of substantiation, the biggest area which the regulators are focusing in on. And that's probably all I've got to say on risk and challenges. Kristy, do you have anything to add on that?
Yeah, I think substantiation is the key point, and that's where people are tripping up, is they're making these claims and are unable to back it up across the full life cycle of the product. And that's something that we're seeing more and more. It's looking at that product holistically, from the manufacturing process, how you ship it, through to the end user and how it's used. And then with services, slightly different. And there's lots of kind of schemes that people can join that, you know, offset carbon emissions and things like that. And I think they need a closer look at as well. And I think there are some risks there that need to be carefully assessed. And kind of when we're looking at what you can do, review, look at the Green Claims Code, look at the other bits of regulation we've talked about, keep abreast of what's going on internally, keep a log of all conversations that you have, meeting minutes. They can be really, really important when it comes to substantiation. And Paul touched on briefly a bit of technology that could be useful for that. And it's incredible how, just conversations and meeting minutes can also contribute to substantiating your claims if you've talked about it internally. Making sure that you know your facts and figures, especially if you're making comparative claims, because how can you make that comparison if you haven't got the data from the competitor that you're trying to compare against? So I'd say that's really key when we're looking at reviewing products. Always get advice if in doubt, whether that's external legal advice or go to a different department and say, look, this is what we're trying to say. What does this make you think? It could be someone that's totally unrelated to your marketing team. It's really important. Those implied messages are just as important as those direct express statements that we make. They're taken in the same way. You can get penalised for making an implied claim about a product that maybe you've done unintentionally. And I can't stress that enough. Most of the time, people trip up without meaning to. There's good intention there. There are some environmental credentials, but maybe they've been fluffed up a little bit and enhanced. And when we're looking at competitors, it's very easy to say, well, we think we're better than them, so we want to talk about that. But are you? You're looking at that full life cycle. And then, as your product or service evolves, like, keep looking at your claims, assess them. Don't just keep using the same strapline. Looking and see if anything's changed. Could you say something better? Because the law is changing. It continues to evolve. Technology is changing. The way we're looking at environmental claims will continue to evolve, and that's a great thing. And it's encouraging companies to be more creative, to really try and improve products and services to be better for the environment. And nobody wants to be guilty of greenwashing. I know some people say that no publicity is bad publicity, but when it comes to the environment, it's not a great look. So think about that continuous monitoring, how you're going to process it internally, and just being aware of what's happening. And especially with the new powers of the CMA to fine, I think it's up to 10% of your turnover. Those risks are getting quite high. It's not necessarily just a tap on the wrist from the ASA. When the CMA gets involved, it's a much bigger risk that you'll be contending with. So that brings us nicely onto what next. And I'll let Paul talk about some really interesting use of AI that we heard about recently.
Thanks, Kristy. So we, Kristy and I had a fascinating conversation last week, a couple of weeks ago, with Deloitte, and they had a very good demonstration of their generative AI model, which was pretty fascinating, really. And their use of relativity, a system called relativity, which the ultimate aim, really, of that tool is to pinpoint greenwashing exposure, if you like. And that tool could be used to interrogate and report on endless amount of documents, really, in terms of where greenwashing or green claims or environmental benefits have been discussed, either in board minutes, letters, email correspondence. So it's it's a really useful tool in picking out the risks of any environmental claims being made in marketing or during discussions or any kind of publicity. And what brought things home to me, and linking it with some of the compliance work where I've been brought in-house, was the different approaches to the risk of making environmental claims within a business. Lawyers compared to marketeers, compared to the finance team, those risks or appetite for risks can often be very different. So whether or not you've got an amazing AI tool to assess those, or whether you're reliant on good record keeping and note taking and reviewing that, as Kristy would say, on a regular basis, it's that risk management which is always should be centered to the business in this area. There are got some other kind of things on the horizon. Shall I mention those now, Kristy? Or
yeah, and then we get on to some questions.
Yeah, sure. Yeah. So certainly in terms of the European directive on substantiation, I think that's a big one coming up. Certainly in terms of marketing products within the EU. Environmental labelling. Many years ago, I worked on this scheme at EU level. I think that shouldn't be forgotten. So when you're making claims about the energy efficiency or recyclability of products which have an environmental label on the product, that is also an area where organisations can trip up on. Other area, environmental whistleblowing, I gave a talk on last week. And certainly soundings are, because the rules over that have changed and changing. And organisations like the Environment Agency have opened a specific portal for this and encouraging people to whistleblow, including on environmental claims. So that's an area which is getting greater publicity. And Kristy mentioned the CMA and also the ASA and the FCA having much greater focus on climate change and environmental claims. And one final thing, announcement today in terms of an investigation by an environmental campaigning group on soft plastics recycling, claims made by Tesco and Sainsbury's, which has hit the headlines today. So it's a kind of usual environmental claims, but much wider than it used to be. And also we're dealing with shareholder claims, activism generally. So massive area, often culminates in environmental claims.